Well, good morning. Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for having me back at NetHui. I was doing a sort of a count up this morning, and I think this is probably my fifth NetHui event between NetHui and NetHui South. Can I just begin by acknowledging Jordan Carter and Internet New Zealand? Thank you for the work that you do putting these events together. So this is the fifth of the main NetHuis, I guess you'd call it. One of the things, strangely, I love about it is just the name. It's such a quintessential New Zealand name that straight away speaks to Kiwis in a way that describes exactly what this event is and how it works. And I love that. I love its uniqueness. And I enjoy the theme that you've set this year too, Jordan. The internet is everybody's business. To me, that's the same way as saying, what I've been saying for a long time, and I know many of you have as well, which is that fundamentally everything's changing. And whether we like it or not, whether we want to engage in it or not, and most of the people in this room, of course, will be very keen to engage in it and will be excited by that change. The reality is that there is a large chunk of the population who don't like change and aren't comfortable with the way the internet is changing every aspect of our lives. I live in a very heartland part of New Zealand, traditional part of New Zealand, and I was recently suggesting at a meeting that we should start sending out the minutes of the meeting by email, and that was met with sort of shock and gasp and a few comments that we don't have any truck with that email nonsense. So there is still a chunk of the population for whom this is still quite edgy and difficult, but the reality is it is inescapable change. And so I think focusing on the fact that actually this is something that we have an obligation, I think, as perhaps those who are more comfortable and more involved with the change, have an obligation to make sure we're bringing all of society with us, not just the sort of the tech heads who've perhaps been comfortable at the front of it. Can I also just acknowledge Kathy Brown from the Internet Society, who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, but I'm delighted that you could be here. I've been hearing great things about the inter-community work that you've been doing, so great that you could be with us for today's event. And my colleague, Brett Hudson, who is here, I'm not sure if there's any other MPs here. If they are, I'm sorry I haven't acknowledged you. So I thought what I would do today is really give you a bit of an update on where we are and what we see coming up next. And look, it won't be any surprise to you that I'm going to start off by talking about our flagship connectivity programs, because while I make the point, whenever I talk, that fundamentally pipes in the ground or wires overhead are not an end in of themselves, and they are not going to be what delivers us transformative change. Equally, the reality is that the sort of transformative change that we're coming to expect and demand and see all around us isn't possible without good connectivity infrastructure. And I'm incredibly proud of where we've got to over the last 6 years. And so I want to just start off by highlighting, I guess, where we are, because I know it sort of gets almost banked quite quickly as soon as you do it. But actually, when you look back, it is significant. So the UFB program that we're putting in place across now 80% of New Zealand is, well, actually, I was going to say delivers $33 billion worth of economic benefit. Actually, those numbers were set on the original program at 75% connection across New Zealand. Across the two programs, the UFB and the RBI, the government's now committed more than $2 billion, and we have 87 different retail providers offering service and service available now in all the candidate areas. So over the last little while, we've started to see a quick acceleration of completed towns where they are all completely fibred and ready to go. And the exciting thing for me is those 11 completed towns are spread across North and South Islands, but are actually all in provincial New Zealand. So we often hear a lot about, it's all about Auckland, it's all about Wellington. In fact, I had a guy last night say to me, why can't I live somewhere else in New Zealand, and be able to connect to the world, or why do I have to be in Auckland? I said, well, I'm sorry, buddy, actually, the towns that we've connected, Whangarei, Wanganui, Taupo, Tokoroa, Cambridge, Blenheim, Ashburton, Oamaru, Timaru. These towns are not main city New Zealand, they are really right out there in the provinces, and I think that's incredibly exciting, because for me, UFB connectivity is the single biggest thing we can do for regional economic development. I regard it as like the railways when they opened up parts of the sort of the Wild West. This brings the ability to any part of New Zealand to connect not only with New Zealand but with the world instantly and without any sort of disadvantage of distance. So it really is game changing. You've probably all seen the stats. The build is now 50% complete. We've just connected our 100,000th user. Connections are going up at the rate of about 350 premises every day getting connected. And we're going to have all schools available to connect by the end of this year. So it's really tracking very well. It's ahead of schedule. It's within budget, which are always music to Minister English's ears. I guess that the acid test, though, is how is that changing both use patterns and speeds. And Akamai recently put out some numbers that tell us that the average internet connection speed in New Zealand has more than tripled since 2009. So that's incredibly exciting and a great start, and of course we're only halfway through the build, and connections across the country, or uptake across the country, is sitting at 13.8%, which is a really good level of connectivity for this stage of the build. But if you think about the fact that we're halfway through the build, uptake is sitting around sort of 14, probably 15% when we get more up-to-date numbers, to already have more than tripled our standard speeds is very impressive. Now, the challenge that I'm constantly facing is that while we have moved the base incredibly in that short space of time, the reality is demand and expectation for always available, always high speed, low contention rates use is accelerating even faster. So, there's constantly the sense of, gosh, the internet's not very good and it's a bit slow, but forgetting that it has got so much faster than it was, so much better than it was, but of course what we're looking for it to deliver is increasing equally fast. If you look at the rural areas, which being a rural person myself is always close to my heart, back in 2011, when this really got underway, we only had 1 in 5 rural properties that could access speeds anywhere near a peak of 5 megabits a second. Now, 5 megabits a second isn't much, and you all in the audience are probably sitting, wow, that's kind of, table stakes, beginner stuff. I can tell you that, my own property, at that time, our speeds was 0.2 megabits a second. So 5 was revolutionary, but still obviously not where we'd like to be. But 1 in 5 had that. Now we're on track to have 4 out of 5 to have at least 5 megabits a second. And of course the RBI program, 300 million in the first stage, partly from government, predominantly from the TDL. And across that program so far, we have uptake of around 25%, 25.2% to be exact, which is a combination of the enhanced copper speeds we're delivering and the fixed wireless from the towers. The other part of the RBI program, which I think gets massively undervalued and not picked up, is the cellular connectivity. And it's very clear to me that while fixed connectivity remains critically important and obviously a big focus for us, mobile connectivity is increasing in importance at a far faster rate than our use rates of our fixed connectivity. And extending that footprint of mobile connectivity across New Zealand is something that's right at the forefront of my mind. So if you're in, the built-up areas, it's probably pretty good most of the time. But actually, when you get out of the main centres, cell phone connectivity gets very patchy very quickly. So we know with those RBI towers, which are in the rural and well, not even that remote, but provincial parts of New Zealand, in 3 months alone, just on one of our networks, 1.8 million unique connections were made to those towers. So that's not 1.8 million calls, that's 1.8 million individual cell phone addresses made contact through those towers. So it is significantly increasing our cell phone connectivity. So that's where we're currently sitting. What comes next? So one of the things I'm constantly saying to my colleagues is that internet connectivity is never done. We can't say, right, well, we've ticked that box, that's good, we've got that one off the agenda. I describe this to my colleagues regularly as being connectivity is effectively running water or electricity. And just in the same way that it would be absolutely unimaginable for us to think of a house that didn't have running water, an inside toilet, or electricity, fundamentally, that's where good connectivity is, and I'd make that fixed and cellular. So this is always a case of moving the bar up, but continuing to look ahead and see where we're going. So at the last election, you'll be aware that we announced another 210 million into the UFB programs to take it out to at least 80% connectivity on the fibre to the home basis, and another 100 million for RBI extension and 50 million for the Mobile Black Spot Fund. Now, most of you in this room probably know we're going through a process at the moment of asking for ROIs from both suppliers, and differently to stage one, asking for communities, particularly via their councils, to engage with us as to how they would like it to work. And the reason for this is pretty straightforward. There's a number of reasons actually. The first is, I'm very pragmatic about this. I have X amount of money, and $360 million sounds like a lot of money, but believe me, when you're trying to roll out connectivity into the least densely populated parts of New Zealand, it doesn't go very far. And I am very anxious to do a couple of things. One of them is to make sure we roll it out into places that have a good understanding of how they're going to use it and how they're going to make it sing and how they're going to really lift their region's performance and not only economy, but also social services and outreach with it. So across New Zealand now, we see a very different picture of how different areas are taking up the connectivity we're rolling out, from Kapiti at 1.9% uptake, up to Whangarei, which is getting up 18-19% uptake. And there really is a very clear distinguisher between the councils and the local economic development agencies and the local champions who are out there talking to people and encouraging them about what connectivity does for them and those who aren't. So firstly, I want to spend my money in areas where it is going to make a difference and it's going to be used. It's no win to me to simply put fibre in the ground. I want to know that it's going to be taken and run with. So that's the first point. The second is I am very reluctant to see a big chunk of that money go in compliance costs. And when you talk to Chorus and the LFCs, there is a very real difference between the councils and communities who are enabling and supportive of the build and the rollout, and those that are perhaps a little bit more difficult to work with and have rules that are a bit more hard to penetrate. So as part of this phase 2, I've asked councils who are constantly in my office saying, why won't you spend more in this area or that area, or we want more here, to say, fair enough. What are you going to bring to the table? How are you going to use it? How are you going to support the build? Are you going to do things like identify where existing underground infrastructure is, and also to get them to help me identify where the priority areas are? Now, I've said to councils, if you turn up and say to me, look, we just want it everywhere, then that doesn't help. Councils are in the best position to know which areas within their rohi are the most in need of better connectivity and how they would structure it. So we've asked them to be part of that mix with us and think about the solutions that would work for their communities. And in the provider space, we've asked them to, again, work with us on the mix of technologies, the design, the critical elements that will make it easier for them to get out and either provide the infrastructure or retail the service. Again, one of the learnings from UFB and RBI1 was that it's all very well providing a wholesale service. If it's not attractive to the retailers to come and sell over that network, it's going to be very difficult to connect. And we've certainly had examples where the network was getting rolled out in some places in the early days, but the retailers were very slow to get in the game. So I want to now look at that network across both wholesale and retail and be very clear what things we can design into the build from the outset that will make that entire ecosystem work well. Because fundamentally, until the customers can turn it on at their house, the job is not complete. So the ROI process closed for providers last Friday, and for communities it's closing tomorrow. And it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of it, of course, but I'm expecting it will be oversubscribed. But even that, I think I can confidently say to you, even when we do UFB2 and RBI2, it's not finished. I don't think this is ever finished. I think we're always going to be saying to ourselves, what's the next thing? How do we continue to evolve this? Particularly in New Zealand. And I make this point a number of times. We are the last bus stop on the planet. We make our living selling to the world. It is critically important to us, far more so than many of our comparator countries overseas, to have good, high-speed, reliable connectivity to the world. We are the most innovative, creative nation, I think, on the planet. We've always had to be able to compete internationally given where we're located. And that weightless economy that we're now really engaging in and showing our mettle in is a tremendous opportunity for New Zealand. So this is critical for us. It's also critical domestically because of the fact we have a small population spread over a very, very large area. And when we need to deliver services and health and education and the like across our populations, the internet is an absolute revolution, and of course how we can do that. Even actually launching into things like, I was just speaking with Andrew as we came in, I see one of the sessions you have in one of the breakout rooms is on online dispute resolution. So, of course, as the Minister of Justice, my ears sort of pricked up and said, oh, great, who's talking about that? I want to hear about how the thinking is in that. So even things as old school and traditional as going off to court and resolving your differences, there's no reason we can't think quite differently about how that works once we have that sort of high-speed connectivity behind us. And whether it's in intelligent transport networks and the spectrum and the regulation around that, whether it's mobile wallets, whether it's, as I say, an e-health and at-home monitoring, the the opportunities really are limitless. So one of the other things that we're working on in this space is, again, thinking about, okay, well, we're rolling this connectivity out. How do we make it work more smoothly for people? And I can tell you the only criticism I really get of the UFB program is, how can I get it sooner? How can I get it faster? And I totally understand the frustration. Jordan, you're lucky you've got it. I don't think I'll ever get it being on a farm in Canterbury, but that's okay. I can just be beneficent and roll it out to everyone else like the tooth fairy. But the frustration is that, look, either you're waiting for it to come down your street and you want to know why it's not there now, or worse, it's down your street and you can't get connected. And one of the real frustrations that I know people have had is when you are down, a shared right-of-way, and you find suddenly that you have to get sign-off of 10 different houses who live down that right-of-way, and if any one of them has got a PIP with you, or is overseas and can't be connected, or is just, a bit odd and thinks it's the government coming to spy on them, you can't get connected. And that fundamentally to me seems wrong. Now, I'm very conscious of private property rights and how we deal with those, but you'll be aware, most of you I'm sure, and if you're not you should be, that I've put out a discussion document at the moment, submissions are still open, looking at how we could recalibrate those consenting issues. Now, I don't mean consenting in terms of resource consenting and councils, I mean neighbours' consents to get across effectively common areas. So whether that's in a high-rise building that has common area entry, whether it's in a business park with a common area network, or whether it's down a shared driveway. I don't think it's right that any neighbour should be able to prevent you getting UFB as long as we follow reasonably careful protectors of their rights. So I'm not talking about cutting up anyone's garden, but if we're going down through shared property and shared driveways, I think we can do that better. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about, and I do want to leave some time for questions, is a big piece of work I see, well, it's already underway, but sort of becoming more public soon, is how the convergence between markets and technologies and platforms is changing so much of what we do, not only what we do at a retail level, but how we as government have to think about it. And I often make the point, I think this is the first NetHui I've spoken at since the election. And I'm probably the first Minister of Broadcasting who went to the Prime Minister and actively lobbied to have the role. And I did it because, having been Communications Minister for 3 years, one thing was screamingly obvious to me, and that was it is becoming increasingly fictitious, I guess, and illusory to think of broadcasting as something wholly distinct from the internet and communications. And when you look at how our system of laws is set up for these areas, they are incredibly siloed on a platform basis. And so you have not only, a device that's specific to a platform, that's specific to a type of communication, and then its own regulatory framework. Now, the days of you had a telephone was the only way to make calls, you had a TV was the only way to watch audio visual, and you had a radio was the only way to listen to audio, those days, as we know, are gone. Back to my earlier point, for some people they still can't imagine watching TV through the internet, but actually for most of us we know that area is accelerating exponentially and will continue to do so. And when I look at the regulatory frameworks that sit behind them, one thing is very clear, which is that they are not calibrated well for a converged platform. When you look at something like the Broadcasting Act, for example, that is our content regulation framework, and it is very narrowly defined to traditional broadcasting channels. Even within that, it's not well calibrated between it and other legislation that it touches on, like the Election Act and the Film Video Classification Act, but it's very much specific to that. When you look at the Telecommunications Act, it is our set of economic regulation in the space, and yet broadcasting is entirely excluded from it. So I personally am of the view that it is well past time now that we have a almost first principles look at communications and media and how we get our information and entertainment and how we communicate really as a single entity, and kick the tyres across the regulatory frameworks we have and ask the questions around whether they are well calibrated for this converged world that we live in, whether there are duplications, whether there are inconsistencies, whether we have, without conscious thought, created an unlevel playing field between the providers. because it won't be news to any of you, but the delineations now between what a Vodafone or a Spark or a 2 Degrees is providing to its customers in terms of packaged over-the-top deals and what TVNZ or RNZ are doing, those lines are blurring, if not vanishing, and yet all of our frameworks are very much still, as I say, very, very vertically separated. My view is that you don't want government leading or defining or constraining innovation in the space. So our job is to make sure that we have regulation that's appropriate to protect New Zealanders, that we have regulation that is effectively platform agnostic, and that we don't either limit or constrain how those markets will develop and evolve. Now, when you start thinking about this, it really does create quite a wide range of topics and issues to think about. Many of them are in my area, either under justice, broadcasting or communications, but obviously it involves many of my colleagues. So, the Minister for Commerce will obviously have to think very carefully and is looking very hard, for example, at intellectual property settings in this converged world. Minister Macleay is looking very much at taxation and how we tax and think about revenue collection and equality of treatment with offshore providers of weightless services. Jurisdictional issues on their own, of course, are a complete minefield for regulators in an internet world. But I think we have to start with a very overarching discussion about how this works and what we need to change from a regulatory setting. One of the parts of that work, which you'll know is underway, is the review of the Telecommunications Act, which will look clearly at these issues from a convergence platform, but also at the very detailed and specific issues around pricing and access methodologies across the various platforms that we have and how that evolves going forward, and can certainly look at, in that wider discussion of work, issues, for example, net neutrality and some of the issues that I know you'll be discussing this week. So I think it's a really exciting time. I'm going to really look to all of you to engage in some of those discussions, because as I say, I think if we don't challenge ourselves to make sure we question every assumption that we have existing in our laws, we run the risk of creating quite perverse and unintended outcomes. Those pieces of work will be coming out in the next few months for further discussion and input, and I'm sure this group of people will be actively engaged in that, and I certainly welcome it. Finally, can I just touch on the Harmful Digital Communications Now Act, I keep wanting to call it Bill, that passed through Parliament with a very overwhelming majority in the last few weeks. Look, this is a piece of legislation that I know has had a lot of discussion and debate, and I think a lot of what has been said about it is really falls into the category of scaremongering. Look, it's a new framework, and with new frameworks you are always carefully making sure you have the balance right and always open to the fact that adjustment will be needed, and very mindful of the fact that, as with any new framework, there will be a period of testing and bedding down by the courts. But I think the points that I would make are simply this. Communications through the internet, we know, have completely different characteristics in terms of the damage that can be done, the viral nature of them, the anonymity of them to communications in an offline world, and we have to recognise that. The biggest part of this framework by a long shot is around education, mediation and civil remedies. And I'm absolutely confident that you will see the vast, overwhelming majority of instances being dealt with through the approved agency, working between the parties to try and get the right positioning. But there is, of course, the criminal provision for the very worst of cases. And if we look at Australia, have had a similar criminal provision for 10 years, we know that a very, very small number of cases have ever got that far. And for those who say it's all about criminalising children, I can tell you that children aren't caught by the Act at all. And for young people up to the age of 18 in Australia, there have only been a very, very small number of the few cases that have been brought. I don't accept the suggestion that anybody who says something about someone online that they don't like is suddenly criminal. That's simply not correct. And actually, if you wanted to read a ridiculously literalist view of legislation, there are many examples you could throw up. So, for example, under the Resource Management Act, on a strict technical reading of the Act, you need a resource consent to sneeze or to light a cigarette. Under the Medicines Act, broccoli should be registered as a medicine because we say it's good for you. So look, anyone can look at these things and create kind of nonsense examples. The reality is that our systems don't permit those sorts of nonsense cases to come forward. And if you look at the Act, if you haven't had a chance, and you read the communications principles, and then you read the factors the court have to consider in making any order, I think you'll find any nervousness you have is largely laid to rest. But, ladies and gentlemen, it is an exciting time to be in my role. I love the role I'm in. I think I'm tremendously lucky to be in my 4th year as Communications Minister. Michelle, it's lovely to see you again. You made the comment before about women not having their voices heard, and if they wanted to have someone speak up for them. Probably not an issue I've really struggled with, but it is great to see you encouraging women to put their voices forward. I don't think we do see enough of it in this space all up. But can I just thank you all for being involved in this conference, wish you the very best for the next few days, and look forward to you engaging with me on some of the interesting issues we have in front of us in the years and months to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. And we have time for some questions. So let us know what questions you have. Put a hand up with a question. Somebody will bring you... Look at that. That's fantastic. Someone will bring you a microphone. It'll be me bringing you a microphone.
Very polite. It's setting a good standard right off the bat there. Here we go. Minister, hello.
Morning.
My name's Dave Lane. I just wanted to ask... many of the legal initiatives and so on that you mentioned just now, the legal policy changes and so on that you mentioned, could actually all be entirely moot as a result of national government's keenness to sign up for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Can you tell me, given that many of us here, in fact all of us here I think, are here because we value openness, how the national government can justify its excusing the secrecy behind the negotiations?
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't accept that most of what we've been discussing here will be moot under the TPP at all. We've made it really clear that we will not enter into that agreement, like any trade agreement, unless it is in New Zealand's best interests. But the fact that the negotiations are not being played out in the media is actually completely consistent with the way we have always negotiated trade agreements. But to be fair, sir, it's not my portfolio. I'm not going to get into a debate here today about the TPP negotiations, except to say that negotiating these things in secret is reasonably consistent, and it is, I think, in our best interest that we would do that. But we have been very clear that unless it is in New Zealand's net best interest, we won't be entering into it. I did make the point that we are a country that makes our living trading with the world, and fundamentally open borders is a significant advantage to New Zealand. Now, that's not to say we don't have to be careful to protect our position, but look, I don't think this is the forum to get into a debate around how these things are playing out in the media or the parameters around it. It's not my area, and I wouldn't want to speak to it at any length.
Question over here. Yes, Paul.
Actually, sorry, this isn't actually a question, Amy. I think I really enjoyed your speech. I'm just a bit concerned that you were saying one thing and the words were being translated onto the screen subtly different in some places. So please, anyone who's going to look at this later, make sure you listen to what Amy actually said and not what's been transcribed. And the other thing is when Michelle gave the emergency number for New Zealand, she said 111. And it came up as 911.
Really?
So for any foreigners who have problems here today, it's not your home number. It is, in fact, 3 ones. Thank you.
That's right.
It's the...
Well, thank you. I can't see the translation, so you just hope it's somewhat faithful.
Bloody loving it. Can I go to this question at the back here, please?
Well, there's the TUI.
Yes, there.
Hello, my name's Suzanne Kendrick. Thanks very much for your speech, Minister Adams. I always like what you've got to say. I don't have a question, I have kind of an update, which I think the audience will find interesting, is that I've put a paper to Minister Adams about a digital business academy for New Zealand, which is to improve the digital business skills of New Zealanders. And the idea is that the government will get behind this rather than all of the local boards going out and trying to do stuff separately. I believe it's in the public good that we work as one and a great big combined platform. Now, I've happened to have found the platform because the British government have already done it, and they want to give it to us under an agreement called the D5, which means that England can give this platform to us. But Minister Adams and Stephen Joyce, etc., need to say, yay, we're good to go, because I've got a lot of interest from big private corporations in New Zealand as well. So if you're online, it's called the Digital Business Academy UK.com. It's already happening. You can see it as a proof of concept, and I'm working to get this to come here. And Minister Adams is hopefully going to be the one that helps. Thank you.
I'm going to take this question here and then we'll go over here.
Good morning, Minister.
Morning.
This is a question directly. As you know, I am a lucky guy who lives in one of the global centers of innovation in New Zealand and in Wamaru. So we have ultra-fast broadband from probably more than a year, and then you opened it, I don't know, 6-8 months ago. I want to know, how are you tracking that? Because what are we using? Are we only downloading movies? Are we only using social media? Or actually, are we taking advantage of the investment in infrastructure that you are doing on behalf of all of us? Because it's a long-term game, and the government position is, okay, we create infrastructure, leave the market to do things. But I wonder if you have a midterm plan to say, what are we actually compensate of uploading real work from New Zealand to the world?
Yeah. Look, thank you for that. We're going to put out some figures shortly, actually, around the amount of traffic being transmitted over the UFB network, just as an interesting piece to show the uptake. I've seen some early numbers, but I'm sorry, I'm just tracking through my mental Rolodex and just can't recall what they are off the top of my head. They're very impressive, I remember that, but I think your question more is around, rather than volume, the types of data that's being transferred across them. And I'm just, I don't have that to my fingertips right now. But the point you make, I think, is exactly the right one, which is that, yep, we can build this stuff, yep, we can get everyone connected, but I've said for a long time, if the only thing UFB does is allow you to do what you already do a bit quicker, then we've missed the point. We've totally missed the point. Now, my view is that having built the network, it grows in a sort of an organic, snowballing way, and to begin with, it might just be, you know, your neighbour gets it and finds he can download movies a bit quicker, and they think, oh, that's good, I'll get it too. And the markets that are taking it up and the rates at which they take it up, I think, are largely influenced by the content and the application of the services that are available within it. So what I'm seeing at the moment, and it's reasonably anecdotal, but there's sort of good levels of uptake at the residential level. There's good levels of uptake at the bigger end of business. The sector that I think is really low and slow at getting into this is the SME sector. So to the point earlier about the Digital Business Academy, for example, we do need to be thinking, I think, now quite creatively about how we now deliver the potential economic benefit that we know the network can provide. Now, it's always a case of, you know, first you build it and then you work on that, and as we're building it, what happens is more players come into the market, more services are developed, people are thinking more creatively about it. And I see it being very much an exponential growth curve in terms of not only the use rates, but the value add that's created from that. So first job is get it in the ground. Second job is get people thinking about how they'd then take that to add value. We're already seeing some very good, innovative examples about how people are using that connectivity to do things differently. You know, I was in Dunedin recently visiting a couple of young guys who'd created startup businesses, moving big data files around with, you know, advertising and design and the like, that they just could not have done previously. And they said to me, what this means is that we can continue to be based in Dunedin and run our businesses across New Zealand and actually significantly undercut those who are based in Auckland and Wellington because of our overheads. So it's starting to happen, but they're more isolated cases rather than a systemic, you know, system-wide change. I think it will come, and we just have to look for opportunities to accelerate it where we can.
We've got time to take one more question. Can I just check to see, is there a digital voice question in the room? Do we have? No? Okay, then can we take that question there?
Oh. Kia ora, Honourable Amy Adams. You clearly have a lot of knowledge and invested interest and a lot of specialist knowledge in your area. And you spoke earlier about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, saying we will not sign anything unless it's in the best interests of New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing is that you have that portfolio for communications and broadcasting.
Mm-hmm.
Yet with all, how you won't have any input into assessing how good this is for the internet or your portfolio areas, justice or broadcasting. I understand it's a small handful of the executive and trade, enterprise and trade ministers that will be representing you. So I'm wondering how can, and also the other significant issue is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, only 5 chapters relate to trade, I understand. This is only through leaked information, and that a lot of it is about intellectual property or the usage on the internet and other platforms. Now, there's a significant area of, in terms of using online platforms for governance and increasing democracy and getting opinions and consultation with people to have participation in how we can, in relation to the economy or different business sectors or the internet, etc. But we see with this Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which involves 12 nations, that it can have considerable impact on us and our businesses and our areas but even you don't even know what's in there, and it's been negotiated, and I understand that it can be ratified before it even goes to Parliament. So I'm keen to hear from you, how do you know what's in there, and can you honestly, as your responsibility, assess the impact of that on our community? Kia ora.
Okay, so fair enough. The first thing I can say to you is that entry into the final document would be a decision of Cabinet, and I'm part of Cabinet. So yes, it's not my portfolio area, and I'm not sitting at the negotiation meetings, but Minister Tim Grosser, who is our Trade Minister, doesn't sign up to it on behalf of Cabinet. It comes before Cabinet, and Cabinet collectively makes a decision with knowledge of all of the obligations and as to what we would do. So no one is negotiating on behalf of all other ministers, and the final decision is made by us collectively. So you're not entirely right in suggesting that somehow it's done to me. I'm a part of Cabinet, and I'll be part of the final decision making around that. The other point is we don't comment on leaked documents about what may or may not be in there, because as you know, this thing has been going for a long time and there's been a number of iterations, and we've just made it a policy of not commenting on what comes out in leaked documents. But I think the heart of your question is to say, will the voice that I bring to the portfolio be represented in that final decision, and will there be someone looking at and thinking about how the final form of the agreement would impact the areas that I am responsible for? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. And those obligations and the impact on all parts of the New Zealand economy are exactly what Cabinet will have to assess and decide.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much for spending time with us this morning and answering those questions on everything, including the TPP. Can we have another round of applause for the Honourable Amy Adams? Thank you. So.